Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our Beginning and End of the Bomb Talk Story series. My name is José Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our talk story will focus on Candles in the Darkness, Stories of Courage from World War II with our special guest and storyteller, Alton Takiyama-Chung. Thank you for joining us today to learn about resiliency during unprecedented times. Local boy Alton Takiyama-Chung grew up with stories, superstitions, and the magic of the Hawaiian Islands. He tells stories of the Plantation Days, the Japanese-American experience of World War II, Asian folk tales, Hawaiian legends, and of course, ghost stories. He has performed in storytelling festivals across the US and internationally, and is also a former chairman of the board of the National Storytelling Network, the national organizations of US Storyteller. Today, Alton will share the stories of four ordinary men who faced impossible situations with extraordinary courage and determination in World War II: Ben Kuroki, Frank Emi, Chiune Sugihara, and Solly Ganor. Experience their stories performed live today on the 75th anniversary of the end of the World War. To get us started, I'm turning it over to our special guest, Alton Takiyama-Chung. Thank you again, Alton.
Well, thank you. If you can spotlight me, that'd be great. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. We've got four stories for you today. What I'll probably end up doing is we'll tell a couple stories. We'll take a short little break because it's a long Zoom conference. Then we'll tell a couple more stories, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. All right? So let's just begin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, veterans, and honored guests. Welcome to this traveling exhibit of the Japanese-American experience of World War II. I am your curator and your humble tour guide. We have collected stories which may allow you to discover some new insights on what it would have been like to be a Japanese-American during the war. We believe that these stories are testaments to the endurance of the human spirit. It is our hope that you will be inspired by all that you experience here tonight. During World War II, Japanese Americans from the west coast of the United States were taken from their homes and their businesses, their communities, and placed into incarceration camps. Of those incarcerated, 40% were children and 70% were American citizens. The immigrants who came from Japan to the United States are called Issei. The children of the Issei, the second generation Japanese Americans born in America, are called Nisei. Some of the Nisei took it upon themselves to volunteer to fight for their country, to prove their loyalty. A handful of Nisei flew in bombers over Europe during the war. But the most famous of them was a man by the name of Ben Kuroki. I grew up in western Nebraska, and my father came from Japan to work as a laborer for the railroads. He became a farmer and settled into the little town of Hershey, just west of North Platte. In my senior year, I was class vice president, and I graduated in the top 5 of my class. Then again, there were only 10 of us, so I guess that's really nothing to really brag about. Well, after high school, I bought a truck and delivered potatoes from our farm to the markets in Oklahoma City. In my spare time, I took flying lessons. In the fall of 1941, I had soloed. Just another all-American kid. Now, on that first Sunday in December, the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, was held a meeting in a church in North Platte. The League is a patriotic group fighting for racial equality. Mike Masaoka, the national secretary of the JACL, was speaking to us when right in the middle of his talk, the police came in, took him away, put him in jail. That's when we learned about Pearl Harbor. Now, my parents taught us about shame, and they pounded it into our heads that never bring shame to ourselves or our family. I felt guilty about what the Japanese had done at Pearl Harbor. I wanted to avenge what the Japanese had done for causing what I considered to be shame. I hated the fact that I was born Japanese. I didn't want to be called a Jap. I wanted to prove my loyalty. I was an American citizen, and I wanted to fight for my country against Japan. Well, the next morning, my younger brother Fred and I decided to volunteer for the Army. We signed up and waited. But the Army never called us back. And then I heard that the Army Air Corps was taking enlistments in the next town over. So I called up the recruiting sergeant and I asked him if race was going to be a problem. He said, heck no. I get $2 for every person I signed up. Your name's Kuroki, right? What did you know? My brother-in-law's Polish too. Well, Fred, the Army Air Corps, Fred and I were the only Japanese recruits around. Then Fred got sent off to a ditch digging unit with no explanation. I spent 21 straight days peeling potatoes. I was pretty miserable. But I was still in the Army Air Corps. The first time I saw a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, it just took my breath away. I mean, it was the most impressive thing I ever saw. It was the most widely produced U.S. heavy bomber of the war. First, I signed up to be a pilot. Then, a mechanic. But eventually, they sent me to clerical school. I was a buck private clerk for the 93rd Bomb Group. But when it appeared that I was going to be transferred, I begged with tears in my eyes to be allowed to go with the rest of the group to go and fight in Europe. I mean, some people thought that I shouldn't go because of my name. My commanding officer said, heck with that. I'm going, and Kuroki, you're going too. Well, they set a tour of duty at 25 missions. I mean, they just pulled that number out of the air. But it gave us something to shoot for. But still, 25 missions it seemed like an impossibly high number to go home. You see, at the time, the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was in its prime. And the German anti-aircraft fire, the flak, was very accurate. A gunner and a bomber, it sits behind these two really powerful, heavy 50 caliber machine guns. But they were helpless against the flak. I mean, the German anti-aircraft shells, the 80th come flying up at the plane. And they just explode, going woof, woof, woof. And the plane would turn this way and turn that way. It was terrifying. And as a gunner, there's nothing you could do. Men just kind of froze behind their guns. And the Air Corps soon discovered that they had this sudden need for gunners. Well, I went to gunnery school. And in 2 weeks, poof, I was a gunner. Now, Jake Epting came from Mississippi. And he was age 22. He was one of the best B-24 pilots around. And Jake had a spot in his plane. And I joined his crew. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, I felt like I belonged. It felt great to be accepted and respected. Nobody cared about my ancestry. I earned a permanent spot on Epting's ship as their top turret gunner. I even got a nickname. They called me the most honorable son. The brass sent us to Algeria. They had us practice low-level flying for a secret mission. We were to destroy the Nazi-held oil fields at Ploesti, Romania. Now, Ploesti supplied all of Italy's and about a third of Germany's oil. It would be a 1,200-mile round trip. We'd barely have enough fuel to make it back to base. Now, Ploesti was also more highly defended per square mile than Berlin. For me, the Ploesti raid would be mission number 24. Operation Tidal Wave began on August 1st, 1943. Our squadron commander took over as our pilot, and Jake, he flew as co-pilot. Our normal co-pilot, 5x5 Jim, he flew as a waist gunner on that mission. 4 other bomb groups joined the 93rd for a total of 178 bombers, 1,751 airmen. We took off and we're flying across the Mediterranean. And then suddenly, the lead plane, the Wongo Wongo, just kind of pitched over and plunged into the sea. We never found out what happened, but it just seemed like a really bad omen. We passed over the Danube and dropped down to about 300 feet and got into formation. About 10 miles from the target, we dropped down to 50 feet and began following the contours of the land. Up ahead, the first group, they kind of took a wrong turn and took everybody off course. But the 93rd, we broke off. We headed back toward Ploesti. But by the time we arrived, the Germans knew that we were coming. And they had baked a cake. These innocent-looking haystacks in front of us just kind of opened up, and suddenly there were all these guns pointed at us. And guns were popping out of railroad cars and fake buildings. Jake just started shouting, "Start shooting! Start shooting!" Then things happened pretty quickly. Someone yelled out, "Junior's on fire!" We all could look to the plane on our right, and it was on fire from nose to tail. I mean, we could actually see people burning up in it. And then that plane just kind of nosed over, exploded into about 1 million pieces. And seconds later, this huge storage tank right in front of us just exploded, and flames leapt up in front of us. And that tank itself, it kind of flew up like a tin can, higher than the flames. I didn't think we were ever going to get out of that. But our squadron leader, he kind of took that plane and he kind of turned it on its side. And I could feel the heat coming up through my turret. And after we got through that, he evened out, and then we saw the Hell's Wench, our group commander, Lieutenant Colonel Baker's plane, in front of us, just kind of pull up. And then we saw one chute come out, and then another chute. And then that plane just kind of nosed over and slammed into the biggest building in front of it. We dropped our bombs, and then the plane just kind of leapt forward. I mean, when you let go of tons of bombs, I mean, your speed just kind of increases. We were flying low and fast. And we were alone. We didn't see anyone else around us. We flew for 13 hours straight. And on that day, 53 bombers were lost. 310 airmen were killed. 1 man in 5. Jake's plane, the Tupelo Lass, didn't have a single bullet hole in it. I felt great that we had made it, but at the same time, I kind of wondered, where are all the others? The thing I remember the most was early the next morning. I mean, the desert was still and quiet. Then I heard someone call out, "Junior! Junior!" It was our normal co-pilot, 5x5 Jim, who flew as a waist gunner during that mission. I mean, he had seen Junior Canfield's plane just burst into flames and crash right before his eyes. Junior was this 18-year-old kid who lied about his age to get into pilot school. Jim and Junior were best friends. Although it was estimated 40% of the refining capability had been damaged in the raid, most of the damage was repaired within weeks. The raid on Ploesti resulted in no meaningful drop in oil production for the Reich. When I'd finished my 25th mission, I volunteered to fly another 5, and I flew those for my brother Fred, who was still in an army unit stateside. On my 30th mission, flak just blasted open my turret. Shards of plexiglass cut my face and shredded my oxygen mask. I would have died if my crewmates hadn't pulled me out of my turret and slapped an emergency oxygen mask on me. In December 1943, I returned back to the States. In the spring of 1944, I was told to report to the Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Driving up to the main gates, I was shocked. See these barbed wire fences and these guard towers and these guards with uniforms and guns and bayonets. Looking behind the barbed wire, I saw people who looked like me. I had learned that they were now drafting Japanese Americans out of these incarceration camps, and I was helped to build morale and recruitment. I was given a hero's welcome. I mean, there was a huge sign saying, "Welcome, Sergeant Ben Kuroki." And a huge crowd, maybe about 3,000 people, about a third of the camp showed up to see me. I talked about my experience as a farm boy, serving my country. I mean, I was really gung-ho. I mean, and I said that in combat, I'd found the acceptance that I craved. I told them that those who fought the draft lacked initiative and were easily influenced by others. And I told them that if they thought Japan was going to win the war, they were crazy. I mean, Japan was going to be bombed off the map. And that's when I heard some hissing, booing. Later on, I met with a small group of Nisei draft resistors and members of the Fair Play Committee. Just couldn't see eye to eye. And after a while, the discussion got kind of heated, to the point where a few of them wanted to beat me up. Hardly anyone was there for my send-off. And after Heart Mountain, they sent me to other incarceration camps like Minidoka and Topaz, but by then, I'd had enough. One day, I tried to get a cab. And I was in my uniform with all my ribbons and medals, but another serviceman refused to share the taxi with me. I mean, he slammed the door in my face and said, "I ain't riding with no Jap." It was after that I decided to get back into the war. I asked the Army Air Corps to let me fly again, this time in B-29s. B-29 bombers, they were larger and flew farther and carried more bombs than any other plane in the war. It was built to bomb Japan. After months of training, I received a letter from the Secretary of War allowing me to serve in the Pacific due to my outstanding war record. I became the first and only Japanese American to serve in active combat in the Air Corps in the Pacific. I was assigned to be a tail gunner in a B-29, and at a stop in Hawaii, the crew named the plane after my new nickname, the Honorable Sad Saki. It referred to a popular cartoon, Sad Sack, about a well-meaning but inept soldier. At our base in Tinian, In the Marianas Islands, there were still Japanese soldiers up in the hills. So wherever we went, my crew always clustered around me. They always made sure that there was someone standing in front of me and someone standing behind me. I always wore my helmet and my dark sunglasses. Well, you see, Marines have a tendency to shoot first and ask questions later. I mean, I couldn't even go to the latrine in the middle of the night for fear of getting shot. I told my commanding officer that he should put me in for a Purple Heart. Why should you get a Purple Heart? Bladder damage, sir. I felt safer going on a bombing mission than I did in our base back in Tinian. It was a 20-hour round trip to Japan. When we flew over Tokyo, about 7,000 feet, the flak was terrible. We dropped our load of incendiaries and the whole city just kind of went up like a match. The incendiaries started a firestorm and 80,000 people died that night. I felt sorry for the women and children. But it was war. In July 1945, Japan's major cities were all gone. I mean, leveled by fire. The next month, a B-29 called the Enola Gay, which is parked next to the Honorable Sasaki, dropped an atomic bomb on Japan. One bomb. Tens of thousands of people dead. Another bomb. Tens of thousands more dead, and many, many thousands dying of radiation sickness. The enemy. Japanese. Men. Women. Children. War was over, and I was going home alive. By the end of the war, I had flown a total of 58 missions. I'd also been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters for a 2nd and 3rd award, and the Air Medal with 5 oak leaf clusters. In 2005, 60 years after the end of the war, I received the Distinguished Service Medal for my combat participation during the war and for overcoming numerous incidents of prejudice in my fight for my right to fight for my country. In part, the citation reads, "For service above and beyond the call of duty, accomplished in both combat theaters of World War II, while serving in 4 separate air forces and taking part in 58 combat missions. Throughout, he overcame many acts of prejudice and earned the nickname Most Honorable Son." Jose, can you spotlight me? I don't think I am spotlighted here. Well, Hot Mountain was one of the 10 incarceration camps set up by the War Relocation Authority in World War II. In 1942, yeah. In 1943, the government wanted to draft young men out of these camps to test their loyalty. The government sent out a questionnaire. At Hot Mountain, a handful of young men refused to answer the questions or be drafted until the civil rights were restored. The leaders of the draft resistance called themselves the Fair Play Committee. One of the more prominent members of the committee was a man by the name of Frank Emmy. Oh, Jose, are you there? I think you're not getting a good recording because you're not spotlighting me. Just letting you know. When you get pushed around enough, somewhere you have to draw the line. You have to take a stand. They wanted to draft us from the camps, and I thought that was wrong. Restore our civil rights, free our families, and we'll be glad to serve. We paid the price for taking a stand. 2 years in prison and 50 years of scorn from our own people. After Pearl Harbor, we never dreamt that we would be getting into any kind of trouble. We Indíce were born in this country. We were U.S. citizens. We were so naive. You cannot imagine the hostility we faced overnight. Suddenly, we were made to feel every bit as guilty as the enemy for simply having a Japanese face. Whipped up by the politicians, the newspapers, and the special interest groups, the president ordered mass evacuations and incarceration. Many Japanese Americans fled the free zone outside of the west coast of the United States. And by the summer of 1942, all of us who remained were forced to leave. 2/3 of us who were incarcerated were American citizens. We owned a small grocery store in Los Angeles, into which we had invested $25,000. That was a lot of money back then, given that milk was 10 cents a quart, potatoes were a penny a pound, and bread was 5 or 10 cents a loaf. We had to sell the store for $1,500, 6 cents on the dollar. Most of the community leaders were arrested by the FBI after Pearl Harbor. Leadership of the Japanese American community was assumed by the Japanese American Citizens League, or the JACL. They said that we should cooperate and evacuate and not cause any trouble. Well, I figured they knew best. I didn't think much about my rights at the time. We could only take 2 50-pound suitcases. My wife and I had a small child and another on the way. We had to pack not only for ourselves, but also for our children. We had to walk between these ranks of soldiers with rifles and bayonets. And behind them was a jeep with a mounted machine gun that kept sweeping left, going back and forth, back and forth. After spending 4 months at the Pomona Assembly Center, we were shipped to the Heart Mountain incarceration site between the cities of Cody and Powell in Wyoming in September of 1942. The day we arrived, there was a dust storm. Our new home was this forlorn and desolate sight, row upon row of wood and tar paper shacks with dust swirling around them. I was frustrated. I couldn't vote. I couldn't work. I couldn't go to school. I couldn't get out. I was just stuck. Were we Americans? Were we aliens? We didn't know who we were. The JACL was led by Mike Masaoka, And he insisted that Nisei had to spill their blood for America. He called for the drafting of young men out of the camps to serve in the military. As JCL spokesman, Mike Masaoka was never put into a camp. In early 1943, the government announced that they would allow Japanese Americans to join the army. Volunteers would be taken to form a segregated unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, led by white officers. Mike Masaoka was the first to volunteer. The drive for volunteers from the camps fell a little short. Of the 14,000 eligible young men, about 1,200 volunteered. At Hot Mountain, of the 2,300 eligible men, 38 volunteered. Those who volunteered from the camps wanted to prove their loyalty and their right to live as good American citizens. I tried to understand their point of view. Yet I was an American citizen. I had done nothing wrong. And I didn't feel I had to prove my loyalty to anyone. But the government, they wanted proof. They made everyone 17 years of older in camp sign a loyalty oath. All of the questions were innocuous except for questions 27 and 28. Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the military forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? By saying yes to this question, did it mean that you were immediately going to go into military service? And what about the women and the elderly? What would happen to them if they said no? Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attacks by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? How can you forswear something to which you had never sworn allegiance? If you answered yes to this question, it implied that at one time or another you had sworn allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. And since the U.S. law did not allow any Issei to become citizens, would answering yes mean that they would lose their Japanese citizenship and become stateless people? Would a family answering no be separated to another camp from those who answered yes? Would answering no mean that you'd be deported to Japan? Nobody was sure of the consequences of a yes or no answer. Bitter arguments erupted between friends or even within families. Would you serve in the U.S. military in combat? Would you renounce all loyalty to the Japanese emperor? Those who answered yes were considered to be loyal. Those who answered no were considered to be disloyal. They were called nonos or nono boys, and they were all rounded up and sent to Tule Lake incarceration camp in Northern California. I answered those questions with a qualification. I wrote on my questionnaire, under the present conditions and circumstances, I am unable to answer these questions. I was willing to serve if drafted, but provided that they gave me back my constitutional rights and returned me and my family back to our home. I thought that maybe others in the camp might have a hard time answering these questions too. So I wrote up my answers to the questions 27 and 28, and my brother and we went on midnight excursions to all the latrines and all the mess halls in camp and posted the answers. I found out later that qualified answers were considered to be same as answering no. In the winter of 1944, the government announced they would now draft Nisei from the camps. Now, as a married man with 2 young children, I was not eligible for the draft. Kyoshi Okamoto called himself the Fair Play Committee of One, said that it was unconstitutional to conscript men who'd been stripped of their civil rights into military service. By incarcerating us, the government had abridged our rights without due process. What was right, and what was wrong, and the government was wrong. The JACL maintained that only unquestioned compliance, military service, and the ultimate sacrifice in war, if necessary, would prove our loyalty to the country. I felt that we could either tuck our tail between our legs like a dog, or stand up and like free men and fight for justice. Some of us chose to resist. We organized and called ourselves the Fair Play Committee, and we urged young men not to go to their physicals or to show up for their induction. The first week, 5 young men did not get on the induction bus. The next week, 7 more failed to appear. The JACL newspaper, the Pacific Citizen, and the CAP newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel, called us resistors. They also called us half-wits and nuts and demented and seditionists and traitors and disloyals. Yet, every week, dozens of young men failed to show up for the draft. Sergeant Mike Masaoka, now the 442nd Unit publicist, warned that we would undoing the good image created by the soldiers, and we would cause them to have shed their blood for nothing. The JACL newspaper threatened that we would be ostracized from American society. The government and the JACL needed a hero, and they found one in a farm boy from Nebraska who had volunteered from the Free Zone. Sergeant Ben Kuroki. He was a top turret gunner of a B-24 and had flown over 30 missions over Europe and Africa and had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice. He was the first Japanese-American hero and the perfect poster boy for the JACL. The government sent Ben Kuroki to build morale and recruitment inside the camps. At Hot Mountain, Kuroki was given a hero's welcome. There was a big sign saying, "Welcome, Sergeant Ben Kuroki," and a huge crowd, a third of the camp, 3,000 people showed up to see him. Oh, all the young women, they thought that he was so very handsome. Kuroki was really gung-ho. He said that those who fought against the draft lacked initiative. I thought, he doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. He was a Nebraska boy. He was a free American. He didn't know anything about the camps. Yet here he was, telling us that we should join the army. The government had taken everything from us, and now they wanted to draft us? Tja. There were guys in camp who wanted to kill him. He was under protection the whole time he was here. And the day Kuroki left, 6 more resisted the draft. On March 24th, 1944, the arrests began at dawn. At Heart Mountain, 1 out of every 9 young men drafted resisted induction. A week later, in the largest mass draft resistance trial in state history, 63 resistors from Heart Mountain stood trial, were found guilty, and were sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. In July of 1944, the FBI came back to Heart Mountain and arrested me and the rest of the Fair Play Committee. It was really hard on my wife. She was not only married to a disloyal, But now she had to raise our 2 young children by herself. The 7 of us were found guilty, and we were sentenced to 4 years at the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary for conspiring to violate the Selective Service Act and counseling other Nisei to resist the draft. Kuroki was interviewed after the trial, and he called us fascists and said that our activities were a stab in the back and that we had torn down all that the Nisei were trying to do. Christmas of 1945, an appeals court threw out our convictions. I was given a new suit, $25, and a train ticket back to Los Angeles. I went back to our family's store to see what had become of it. It had changed hands during the war. And the new owner, I said to them, we used to own this store, and before the war, but we were forced to sell it when we were evacuated. And I asked him how much he paid for the store. He said that he had paid almost $100,000. The resistors were finally released in 1946. On Christmas 1947, we learned that the Fair Play Committee had been pardoned by President Truman. After the war, several of the resistors were again drafted for the Korean War, but this time as free citizens with all of their rights. They gladly served. Many veterans felt that they and their buddies had put their lives on the line, and many had never come back. They felt that they had done the right thing. Their friends had died for their country. How dare we not serve? We felt that we had put our lives and our reputations on the line. We felt that we had done the right thing. We were made social outcasts from the Japanese American community, unrecognized, forgotten. Those of us who resisted rebuilt our lives in isolation. The shame of having a son called a draft dodger hurt parents as well. One resistor's mother was ostracized by the Issei community, and the last thing that happened was that she was told not to come back to church anymore. It was shortly after that that she took her own life. In July 2000, the JACL finally voted to apologize to the Heart Mountain resistors. Even then, several JACL old-timers walked out in protest. FDR said that Americanism is not a matter of race or ancestry. Americanism is a matter of the mind and heart. He said that about men who fought in combat. But we fought on a battlefield of our own. We took a stand as Americans. We paid the price for doing what we thought was right and standing up for our rights. Today, members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee are now viewed as different, yet complementary examples of praiseworthy Americanism. I have no regrets about what we did. And yet, the healing needs to continue with compassion and understanding. In the course of human existence, many people are tested, but only a few achieve true greatness through simple acts of kindness. Our next speaker is a man who, when confronted with evil, obeyed the kindness of his own heart in defiance against orders from an indifferent government. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Chiune Sugihara. Good evening. Thank you for allowing me to be here with all of you. In 1939, I was appointed as the vice consul to the Japanese consulate in Kaunas, Lithuania. My primary responsibility was to keep an eye on the German and the Russian troops near the Lithuanian border. I could speak Russian and German and French and English, and so it was a very easy assignment for me. I had brought my entire family with me, my wife and her sister and my boys. I had 3 young sons at the time. We had a very comfortable and peaceful life in Kaunas. Then Germany invaded Poland from the west in September of 1939. 2 weeks later, Russia invaded Poland from the east. Soon, thousands of refugees were flooding across the Lithuanian border, fleeing the Germans and the Russians. I did not know much about the plight of the Polish Jews until one night I was invited to a Hanukkah dinner by a Jewish boy by the name of Solly Ganor. I met him at his aunt's gourmet food store, and he impetuously invited me to a Hanukkah dinner. It was the first Hanukkah celebration I'd ever been invited to. There, I met some refugees from Poland, and they told me stories of what happened to Jews who were captured by the Nazis. They did terrible things. Time went on, and on June 15th, 1940, Russia invaded Lithuania. And I prepared to close the consulate and report back to the Japanese embassy in Berlin for reassignment. I thought my work in Kaunas was over. Then one day, a Polish refugee came to see me. He had an entry visa on his passport to a place called Curacao. It was a Dutch island colony in the Caribbean. He had come to request a transit visa, which would allow him to pass through Japan on his way to this Dutch island. I thought nothing of it. I stamped his passport and wrote him out a transit visa. But the next day, there are all these people outside of my house, maybe 200, men, women, children, all begging to see me. Who were these people? What did they want? I asked a few representatives to come and tell me what they wanted. They all wanted transit visas. They had gone to all the other consulates in Kaunas, and I was their last hope. Oh, I told them I wanted to help them, but I could not possibly grant so many visas. I needed to go and cable my government for permission. I did so. And the answer came back, no. I told them I was very sorry, but I could not give them the transit visas. But they did not go away. The line grew. Now there's even more people outside of my house, and my wife and my children, they were getting frightened. They stood in the street, their suitcases and their coats. They were desperate, their eyes red with fatigue and tears. They looked so sad. I cabled my government again. And again, the answer came back, no. Day after day, they kept coming, asking for visas. These are human beings in need. Seeing them face to face, begging with tears in their eyes, I could not help but feel sympathy for them. Among the refugees were elderly and women. Oh, they were so desperate that they went so far as to get down on their knees and kiss my shoes, begging for help. I cabled my government a third time, describing the desperate situation. And the answer came back, no. I had a decision to make. I knew that if I defied the orders of my superiors, I would probably get fired, disgraced, and may not work for the government again. And assisting refugees, oh, that had other grave consequences. You see, to the Russians, anyone leaving the country, oh, they were considered to be traitors. And anyone helping them leave, oh, that was a capital offense. And to the Germans closing in from the west, oh, helping a Jew, that might be punishable by death, not just for me, but for my entire family. But if I did not do anything, these people will surely die. There was no place else for them to go, and they trusted me. Even if I waited any longer and permission was granted, it might be too late. This was too big a decision for me to make by myself. And so I discussed the situation with my wife and my family. In the end, it was my eldest son who said that we had always taught him to put himself in someone else's shoes. If he were a child standing outside, what would he want someone to do for him? The visas would be written. Although I disobeyed my government, not to do so would be to disobey God. From July 31st to August 28th, 1940, I wrote visas. I wrote for 16 hours a day, writing and signing visas by hand. One day, I wrote over 300 visas. That's normally more than what I would do in an entire month. Crowds of hopeful refugees arrived in droves, and the Soviet authorities instructed all foreign embassies to leave Kaunas. Almost all left, but I requested and received an extension to continue my work. One day, a man by the name of Moses Zupnik arrived. He came to me with his Curacao visa and requested 300 transit visas for the Mia Yeshiva, an entire Jewish school dedicated to the study of the Talmud. I looked him straight in the eye and I said, "Come back next week and you will have your visas." Now that Russia had invaded Lithuania, the refugees also needed a Russian exit visa. I spoke to the Soviet officials and they agreed to allow the Jews to travel through Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad for only 5 times the normal rate. It was very expensive, and many sold all they had just to be able to make the journey. On September 4th, the Russians insisted that the Japanese consulate be closed. By that time, I had granted thousands of visas, many to heads of households who could take entire families and travel with them. My family and I packed up our belongings, prepared to leave the Japanese embassy in Berlin for reassignment. By then, I was exhausted. I looked like a refugee myself. I took my family to a hotel to rest before leaving. But when we got to the hotel, the refugees came looking for us, and so I wrote out more visas. The next day at the train station, they were there too, and I wrote more visas on the platform until the train left. Once we got on board, people were hanging onto the window, and I wrote some more. By then, I was simply signing my name to blank pieces of paper and handing them out through the window. And when the train began to move, I could write no more. I handed the consular visa stamp out the window to a refugee, hoping that he might be able to help some others. Everyone was waving, and one of them called out, "Thank you, Mr. Sugihara. We'll come and see you again." And he began to run along the side of the train. I could not help but cry. Even now, when I think about it, I cannot help but weep. At the end of the war, Soviet troops imprisoned me and my family in a POW camp for 18 months. We were finally released in 1946. In 1947, the Japanese Foreign Office asked me to resign. Downsizing, they said. Confidentially, the foreign minister told me that I was being dismissed because of that little incident over in Lithuania. Afterwards, I worked odd jobs as a translator, an interpreter, and eventually I got a job with an import-export firm, a Japanese import-export firm, and worked in the Soviet Union for 16 years, so my family remained in Japan. I used the name Senpo Sugiwara when I worked for the Japanese company in Moscow, so that the Soviet government would not recognize me as a former diplomat. In 1968, one of the people who had received one of my visas and who had survived the war finally located me and contacted me. Until then, I had not known that anyone had survived those awful times. I was so happy to know that I had done some good. I was thrilled to learn that the people of the Mir Yeshiva had survived the war, and it was the only European yeshiva to have survived the Holocaust. In 1984, I was granted the designation Righteous Among Nations by the government of Israel and Yad Vashem. I was the first Asian ever to be awarded that honor. Today, it is estimated that there may be 40,000 people alive today because of what I did. If you have an opportunity to help someone in your lifetime, do it. Do what is right because it is right. The flame of a single candle can hold back even the darkest night. We Jews have a saying, if you save one life of one person, it's as if you save the entire world. Kaunas, Lithuania, a tiny little dot on a map for most Americans, but it is where I grew up. I was 11 years old when Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1938, September of 1939. 2 weeks later, Russia invaded Poland from the east, and for the next several months, Polish Jews began flowing across the Lithuanian border, fleeing the Nazis and the Russians. In December of that year, like all of the Jewish children in Lithuania, I decided to give my Hanukkah geld, my Hanukkah money, to the refugees who had nothing. But then, wouldn't you know it, the new Laurel and Hardy film came to town, and I just had to see it. I went to my aunt's gourmet shop to ask her for the money to see the movie. When I got there, I saw this elegantly dressed man with strange slanted eyes. I'd never seen a Japanese man before. And he smiled at me, and his eyes were kind and gentle. I explained to my aunt what I wanted, and the Japanese man laughed, and he pulled a coin out of his pocket and said, yeah, take it. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I cannot take money, not from a stranger. You are not family. For the holidays, consider me to be your uncle. I took the coin. Thank you, uncle. My name is Solly Ganor. And my name is Chiune Sugihara. Chiune Sugihara. He was the Japanese consul in Kaunas. Well, time went on. And Germany invaded Lithuania in June of 1941. My family and I were split up. And I was eventually sent to Bavaria in southern Germany, to a little town outside of Munich called Dachau. I witnessed horrible, terrible things. But I survived. And then in the winter of 1945, in the middle of the night, we were all rousted out of our barracks and forced to march into the frozen night by the SS guards. We marched, and we marched, and we marched. For 6 days we marched. By then I was weak, I was exhausted. And I finally just collapsed into a snowbank on the side of the road, where the guards left me to die. I was drifting away, and suddenly I felt myself being pulled out of the snow. I opened my eyes and looked into a face, and its strange slanted eyes. I remembered Sugihara had slanted eyes. There were 4 of them, all tired and unshaven, dressed in khaki uniforms. And although they were speaking English to each other, I knew they were Japanese. I thought to myself, these Japanese are here to kill me. And I just didn't care anymore. Go ahead, kill me. Get it over with. He just stared at me. We are Americans. We're not going to kill you. Oh, no. You're Japanese. You're going to kill me. We went back and forth. And finally, this Japanese soldier dressed in an American uniform fell on his knees weeping. You're free now, boy. We are Japanese Americans. You're free. I looked to this man's eyes, and I saw kindness in his tearing eyes. It was only then that I believed. His name was Clarence Matsumura, and he was with the 522nd Artillery Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the all-Japanese American unit. And they were among the first to discover and liberate the complex of concentration camps around Dachau. I thought it was ironic that Clarence and his kinsmen would volunteer to fight and die for the United States, while many of their families were being held in American relocation centers. After the war, I moved to Israel. Over the years, I didn't speak of my experience with anyone except fellow survivors of the camps. In all the years since my liberation, I had never cried. A psychiatrist told me that the trauma of the Holocaust had dried up my tears, and that I was like an emotional amputee and would never cry again. In 1992, I got a call from a man by the name of Eric Saul, a historian from San Francisco. He said he was there with a group of Japanese Americans who were among the liberators of Dachau in 1945. They had come all the way from Hawaii and California to Israel to be honored by the Knesset. Would I please come to meet them? I met them in the lobby of their hotel, a small group of Japanese Americans in the early 70s. And they asked me to read an account of what I had written, describing the first time I'd met members of the 522nd Battalion. As I began to read, another man in his early 70s, gray hair, glasses, joined the group. When I got to the part where I was lying in the snow and the 4 men of the 522nd drove up, I looked up at the man, the newcomer. I looked into his eyes, and I saw that they were filled with tears. I stopped reading. I couldn't go on. I couldn't speak. After years of suppressing the unsuppressible, the tidal wave of emotion began erupting inside of me. And I began to weep. The boy that I had buried so deep down within me all those years had finally come out of hiding. And it was he who was weeping. The whole group gathered around me to comfort me. No, be embarrassed. You are among friends. It was the voice of the newcomer. Solid. This is Clarence Matsumura. I stared at this man. Gray eyes, glasses. How could it be? I couldn't tell. And then he smiled. Oh, nothing could change that smile. Oh, we fell into each other's arms. Oh, and all the years melted away. I was weak, and he held me up, just as he had done 47 years ago on the road to Valkerken, south of a little town called Dachau. That concludes our tour for today. I hope that you've gained some new insight into the Japanese-American experience of World War II. Please come again. As long as the exhibit is open, I will be here.
Thank you again to Alton for sharing those wonderful stories with us today. Truly have an amazing talent, and we are so honored to have been able to witness this live today. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn about the stories of each one of those change makers and their own resiliency during these unprecedented times 75 years ago. A story that provides definitely a breath of fresh air of hope and vision to overcome challenges in our own lives as peace builders. Last but not least, to you all, thank you to all of you for joining today's webinar. We deeply appreciate your interest and support in joining us to learn about resiliency during unprecedented times through our Beginning and End of the Bomb Talk Story series. Thank you again, everyone.